There is something in the woods. For as long as humans have walked among the trees, we have sensed that we are not alone. Something moves in the shadows just beyond the firelight. Something watches from the ridgelines at dusk. Something leaves footprints in the morning mud that do not match any animal we have named. The indigenous peoples of North America understood this. For thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived with their maps and categories and certainties, the native tribes spoke of creatures that shared the forests with them. These were not myths in the way we often use that word, not fantastical stories invented to explain thunder or teach moral lessons. They were practical warnings passed from generation to generation about something real. The Sansilo people of British Columbia called them Sasquatch, a word that translates roughly to wild man or hairy giant. The Lummi people of what is now Washington State spoke of the Tisameques. The Hupa, living in the dense redwood forests of Northern California, told of Oma, a wild creature of immense size and strength. The Lakota knew of creatures they called Chie-Tanka, the big elder brother. Across dozens of distinct cultures and languages, separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of independent development, the descriptions remained remarkably consistent. These creatures were said to be massive, 7 feet tall or more, some reaching heights of 9 or 10 feet. They walked upright like men, but were covered entirely in hair, like animals. They were strong beyond human comprehension, capable of lifting boulders and tearing apart the carcasses of elk. They were intelligent, aware, and deeply private, preferring to remain hidden in the most remote places the land had to offer. When European settlers began pushing west, they brought their own assumptions. The wilderness, they believed, had no secrets that science could not eventually reveal. The native stories were dismissed as superstition, the product of primitive minds attempting to explain natural phenomena they did not understand. This confidence eroded slowly, then quickly. Settlers in the Pacific Northwest began reporting encounters with creatures that matched the native descriptions precisely. Loggers working in remote camps found footprints pressed deep into the earth, footprints that suggested a bipedal animal of extraordinary size. Hunters reported glimpsing massive hair-covered figures moving through the trees. Prospectors, missionaries, and early homesteaders all contributed to a growing body of testimony that something unknown lived in the mountains. For decades, these reports remained local curiosities, shared around campfires and in small-town newspapers, but never reaching national attention. That changed in August of 1958, when a construction worker named Jerry Crew made plaster casts of enormous footprints he had discovered at a road construction site in Humboldt County, California. The local newspaper ran a story, and they needed a name for whatever had made the tracks. They called it Bigfoot. The name captured public imagination in a way that Sasquatch never had. Within years, Bigfoot had become a cultural phenomenon, the subject of books, television specials, and serious scientific debate. Researchers began systematically collecting and analyzing reports. Expeditions were mounted into remote wilderness areas. A new field of study emerged, dedicated to documenting and investigating encounters with this creature that science insisted could not exist. And the encounters kept coming, thousands of them over the decades that followed. Hunters who stumbled upon creatures in the forest, families who found their campsites watched by something unseen, truck drivers who caught glimpses of massive figures crossing lonely highways in the dead of night, forest rangers who served decades in remote postings and learned to recognize signs of activity that appeared in no field guide. The witnesses came from every background and every walk of life. Most had nothing to gain by speaking and much to lose. Many never told anyone at all, carrying their experiences to the grave. Tonight, we will explore 12 of these encounters in depth. I have selected accounts that span nearly a century, from the wilds of Washington State to the forests of Tennessee. from the mountains of California to the lakes of Ontario. Some are famous cases that have been analyzed and debated for decades. Others are lesser known, circulated among researchers, but never reaching mainstream attention. All of them share certain qualities that set them apart from the thousands of reports on file. The witnesses were credible. The details were specific. The circumstances made hoaxing or misidentification unlikely. And in the years and decades since, the accounts have remained consistent, unchanged by time, unblemished by contradiction, as solid as the footprints pressed into the earth. I will not tell you what to believe. That is not my purpose here. I will only tell you what these people reported in as much detail as the historical record allows. I will describe what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. I will share the evidence they left behind and the questions that remain unanswered. The conclusions are yours to draw. The hour is late, the forest is dark, the fire has burned low, and the shadows press close around us. Let us begin. Our first account takes us back exactly 1 century to the summer of 1924 and to a remote mining claim on the slopes of a volcano that would later become famous for very different reasons. Mount St. Helens rises over 8,000 feet above the forests of southwestern Washington state. In 1924, it was not the barren, crater-topped peak we know today. That transformation would not come until 1980, when a catastrophic eruption reshaped the entire mountain. In the summer we are concerned with, St. Helens was a pristine, snow-capped cone, surrounded by some of the densest and most inaccessible forest in the Pacific Northwest. 5 men had established a mining camp in a narrow gorge on the mountain's eastern slopes. They were searching for gold, as so many had before them, drawn by rumors of rich deposits in the volcanic soil. The men were Fred Beck, his father-in-law Gabe Lefevre, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and a 5th man whose name has been lost to history. They were experienced outdoorsmen, all of them, comfortable with hard work, isolation, and the casual dangers of wilderness life. The camp was modest, a small cabin, perhaps 12 feet by 16, constructed from rough-hewn logs they had felled and notched themselves. A crude fireplace for warmth and cooking. No windows, just gaps between the logs that let in slivers of light during the day and cold drafts at night. A single heavy door, hung on iron hinges, provided the only entrance. Getting there had required 2 full days of hiking from the nearest road, following game trails and old logging cuts through terrain so rugged that a man could walk for hours and cover only a few miles as the crow flies. They had brought supplies on their backs and on the backs of pack animals, enough food, tools, and ammunition to sustain them for weeks of work. For the first several days, the work proceeded normally. They dug exploratory shafts into the hillside. They panned the nearby streams for color. They lived the hard but familiar life of prospectors, their routine interrupted only by the sounds of the forest and the distant calls of birds. But from almost the first day, something felt wrong. Fred Beck would later describe it as a sensation of being watched, not the ordinary awareness that comes from living among wildlife. He knew that feeling well, but something more focused, more intentional. When he looked toward the tree line, he sometimes caught a flicker of movement just at the edge of perception. When the group fell silent, they occasionally heard sounds that did not fit the usual pattern of the forest. Heavy footfalls, the crack of branches under significant weight. They discussed these observations among themselves, but reached no conclusions. Bears were common in the area, as were elk and deer. The forest was alive with creatures, any of which might account for what they were sensing. They were tired men, working hard in difficult conditions. The mind could play tricks. Then came the footprints. Fred Beck discovered them near the stream where they drew their water. The ground was soft there, kept moist by the constant flow, and the prints were pressed deep into the mud. They were human-like in shape, a clear heel, a ball, 5 distinct toes, but impossibly large. Beck measured them at 19 inches from heel to toe. The stride between prints, where the creature had walked along the bank, stretched nearly 5 feet. The men gathered to examine the tracks. They debated their origin. Some suggested a hermit, perhaps a man living wild in the mountains, who had fashioned some kind of oversized footwear. Others were less certain. The prints did not look made by shoes or wrappings. They looked organic, pressed into the mud by something with actual flesh and weight. In the end, they decided to continue their work. They had invested too much time and money in the claim to abandon it over footprints, however strange. They would simply be more vigilant, keep their rifles close, and watch the tree line. This resolve was tested on the afternoon of July 12th. Fred Beck had stepped away from the main work site to scout a secondary drainage. He was perhaps 200 yards from the cabin, moving quietly through the underbrush, when he looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of a small canyon, perhaps 100 yards distant. It was not a bear. Beck froze. The figure stood motionless, watching him from across the ravine. It was upright, standing on 2 legs with an easy, balanced posture. It was enormous. Beck would later estimate 7 feet tall or more, with shoulders that seemed nearly 4 feet wide. Its body was covered in dark hair, thick enough that no skin was visible. Its face was flat and broad, with what appeared to be a heavy brow ridge overhanging the eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Man and creature stared at each other across the distance. Then, without apparent urgency, the thing turned and walked into the forest, moving with long, unhurried strides that carried it quickly out of sight. Beck returned to camp and reported what he had seen. The reaction was mixed. Some of the men wanted to leave immediately, to pack up and hike out before nightfall. Others argued that what Beck had seen was surely a bear. A large bear, yes, perhaps behaving strangely, but nothing that 5 armed men needed to fear. The discussion grew heated. Voices were raised. In the end, they decided to stay. They would keep watch through the night, maintain a fire, and leave at first light if anything else occurred. Something else occurred. It began around midnight. The men were asleep in their bunks, or trying to sleep, as the earlier tension had left them all on edge. When a heavy impact struck the north wall of the cabin, then another, then a third, harder than the first 2, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Fred Beck reached for his rifle. Around him, the other men were scrambling from their bedrolls, grabbing weapons, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a rock crashed through the roof. It was the size of a man's fist, jagged and rough, and it landed among them with a sound like a gunshot. Before they could react, another rock struck the east wall, then another. Then a volley of impacts from multiple directions, as if the cabin were surrounded by assailants with an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. What followed was a siege that lasted until dawn. The creatures, and there were clearly multiple attackers, based on the directions of the impacts, hurled rocks at the cabin with a ferocity that defied explanation. Some of the stones were small, pebbles and fragments, but others were large enough to dent the thick log walls. The men crouched in the darkness, unable to see their attackers, unable to do anything but listen to the relentless bombardment. At one point, something grabbed the door. The entire frame shook as massive hands, for that is what they must have been, tried to tear the door from its hinges. The men had barricaded it with everything they could find, and the barrier held, but the strength behind the assault was terrifying. This was not an animal scratching at an obstacle. This was something applying deliberate, focused force. The men fired their rifles through the walls. They aimed at sounds, at shadows glimpsed through gaps in the logs, at anything that seemed to offer a target. In the muzzle flashes, they caught fragmentary glimpses of what was outside. Dark shapes, massive and moving, circling the cabin like predators around trapped prey. Fred Beck would later describe a moment when a hand reached through a gap between logs. Just a hand, or rather, just the fingers, because the gap was not wide enough to admit more. But the fingers were enormous, covered in dark hair, with nails that looked almost like claws. Beck fired directly at the hand, and from outside came a sound he would never forget, a howl of rage and pain that seemed to shake the night itself. The attack did not stop. For hour after hour, the bombardment continued. Rocks struck the walls, the roof, the door. Footsteps circled the cabin, heavy bipedal footsteps that shook the ground. Occasionally, the creatures would vocalize, making sounds that were neither human nor animal, but something in between, something that carried both meaning and menace. The men did not sleep. They did not lower their guard. They simply waited, rifles ready, praying for dawn. When the sky finally began to lighten, the attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. One moment the bombardment was continuing, rocks still striking the walls, footsteps still circling in the darkness. The next moment, silence. An abrupt, total silence that was almost as terrifying as the noise that had preceded it. The men waited another hour before venturing outside. When they finally opened the door, rifles raised, they found a landscape transformed. The ground around the cabin was littered with rocks, hundreds of them, some weighing several pounds. The walls of the cabin were dented and cracked. Deep gouges marked the door where something had tried to tear it open. And leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest, they found footprints, dozens of them pressed deep into the earth, heading up the mountain and into the unknown. The men did not investigate further. They gathered what belongings they could carry, left the rest, and began the long hike out. They would never return to the claim. The gold, if there was gold, could stay where it was. Fred Beck lived another 70 years. He became a Pentecostal minister, raised a family, and lived what, by all accounts, was a quiet and ordinary life. But he never forgot what happened on that July night, and he never stopped speaking about it. In 1967, he published a small pamphlet titled, "I Fought the Apes of Ape Canyon," describing the incident in detail. His account never varied. His conviction never wavered. Until his death in 1993, Fred Beck maintained that what attacked them that night was not bears, not men, and not anything known to science. The gorge where the attack occurred was later named Ape Canyon by the United States Geological Survey. The name persists on maps to this day, a quiet monument to a night of terror on the slopes of a volcano. 17 years after Ape Canyon, and several hundred miles to the north, a family in rural British Columbia had an encounter that would become one of the most thoroughly investigated early Bigfoot cases on record. The setting was the Fraser Valley, a region of rolling farmland and dense forest east of Vancouver. In 1941, this was frontier country, sparsely populated, accessible only by rough roads, and bordered on all sides by wilderness that stretched unbroken to the distant mountains. The Chapman family had settled it on a small property near Ruby Creek, a community so small it barely qualified as a village. George Chapman worked on the railroad, maintaining the tracks that connected the isolated settlements of the valley. His wife Jeannie kept house and raised their 3 children. It was a modest life, defined by hard work and the rhythms of the seasons. The Chapman home sat at the end of a long lane, surrounded by fields they had cleared and planted with vegetables. Beyond the fields, the forest began, a wall of Douglas fir and western red cedar that seemed to absorb all sound and light. It was a warm afternoon in early September. George was away at work, as he often was during daylight hours. Jeannie was in the kitchen, washing the dishes from the midday meal, while the children played somewhere in the house or yard. The day was ordinary, indistinguishable from 100 others. Then Jeannie looked out the window. At first, she thought she was seeing a bear. Bears were common in the area, black bears mostly, though grizzlies occasionally wandered down from the mountains. They sometimes approached the property, attracted by the smell of food or the promise of easy foraging in the vegetable garden. Jeannie had seen bears before and knew the protocol: make noise, appear large, wait for them to lose interest, and wander away. But as she watched, the shape at the edge of the field did something bears do not do. It stood up, not rose onto hind legs the way a bear might briefly do to gain a better vantage point. Stood up, straightened. assumed an upright posture as natural as a human's, and began walking toward the house. Jeannie's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The figure was massive, 7 feet tall at minimum, perhaps 8, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. It was covered entirely in hair, a yellowish-brown color that caught the afternoon light. Its arms were long, hanging nearly to its knees, swinging slightly as it walked. Its head appeared small in proportion to its body, sitting directly on the shoulders with almost no visible neck. And it was walking directly toward her, across the open field, with what she would later describe as a determined stride. Jeannie did not wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed her children, the youngest in her arms, the older 2 by their hands, and fled through the back door. She did not stop to lock up, did not stop to gather possessions, did not stop for anything. She simply ran. They covered nearly a mile, through fields and woods and along rough paths, before reaching the home of a neighbor. By the time they arrived, the children were crying, and Jeannie was barely coherent, trying to explain what she had seen through gasps and tears. When George Chapman returned home that evening, he found the house in disarray. The back door stood open. Dishes sat half-washed in the sink, but nothing had been taken, nothing destroyed. The creature, whatever it was, had apparently departed without entering. George examined the property carefully. Near the edge of the field where Jeannie had first spotted the creature, he found what he was looking for: footprints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, clearly defined, 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. He followed them partway across the field, toward the house, then lost them where the ground became harder. Around the house itself, he found more prints, circling the building as if the creature had walked its perimeter multiple times. There were places where it appeared to have stopped, as if peering in through windows or examining the structure. George did not know what to make of any of it. He was a practical man, not given to fantasy, and he had never heard stories of creatures like what Jeannie described. But the evidence was undeniable. The footprints were there, plain as day, and his wife was not a woman given to hysteria. The family did not sleep in the house that night. They stayed with neighbors, huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread through the small community. Other residents came forward with their own observations. Strange sounds had been heard in the nights before Jeannie's sighting, screams and howls that did not match any known animal. Dogs had been behaving strangely, refusing to venture far from houses after dark. Several people reported feeling watched when walking near the forest's edge. The Chapman family refused to return to the property. George arranged for their belongings to be moved, and they relocated to another part of the valley. Jeannie, in particular, could not bear the thought of living in that house again. Knowing what had walked across the field toward her, knowing it might return, the case might have faded into local legend and been forgotten, like so many others, had it not attracted the attention of researchers in the 1950s. John Green was a journalist and newspaper publisher based in British Columbia, who had developed a serious interest in Sasquatch reports. Working with researcher René de Hinden, a Swiss immigrant who would dedicate his life to investigating the phenomenon, Green tracked down Jeannie Chapman more than a decade after the incident. What he found was remarkable. Jeannie's account had not changed. Every detail, the creature's size, its coloring, its gait, the way it had walked across the field, remained exactly as she had described it in the days after the sighting. She was not eager to discuss the experience, still clearly disturbed by what she had seen, but she answered questions thoroughly and consistently. More importantly, Green discovered that the Chapman incident was not isolated. Other residents of the Ruby Creek area had similar stories: sightings, footprints, strange sounds in the night. A pattern emerged of activity concentrated in that particular area, as if something was living in the nearby forests and occasionally venturing close to human habitation. The Ruby Creek incident became a foundational case in early Bigfoot research, one of the first to be subjected to systematic investigation. The Chapmans were not seeking attention or profit. They were a private family who had experienced something terrifying and wanted nothing more than to forget it. But memory, as Jeannie discovered, does not work that way. Decades later, an old woman by then, she could still describe the creature with perfect clarity. The yellowish-brown hair, the long arms, the small head on massive shoulders, and the eyes. She could still remember the eyes fixed on her through the kitchen window, watching as she reached for her children and ran. On October 20th, 1967, two men on horseback captured what remains, more than half a century later, the most famous and most intensively analyzed piece of footage in the history of Bigfoot research. Roger Patterson was a rodeo rider from Yakima, Washington, with an obsession that had consumed him for years. He had read every account of Bigfoot sightings he could find. He had interviewed witnesses across the Pacific Northwest. In 1966, he had self-published a book titled "Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist?" that compiled everything he knew about the phenomenon. Patterson was convinced that Bigfoot was real, and he was determined to prove it. He had been planning an expedition to northern California, where a concentration of recent sightings had attracted attention from researchers nationwide. Bob Gimlin was a different kind of man. A skilled horseman and tracker, he had been Patterson's friend for years, but did not share his obsession with Bigfoot. Gimlin was skeptical by nature, practical, the sort of person who believed in what he could see and touch. But he was also loyal, and when Patterson asked him to come along on an expedition into the wilderness, Gimlin agreed. The destination was Bluff Creek, a remote tributary of the Klamath River in Northern California's Del Norte County. Earlier that year, a road construction crew working in the area had discovered large, human-like footprints in the mud, prints that matched descriptions from previous sightings. Patterson saw an opportunity. The two men trailered their horses to the end of a rough logging road and began riding into the backcountry. They spent days exploring the area, following old trails, examining promising locations. The terrain was rugged, steep hillsides covered in dense timber, creek bottoms choked with fallen logs and underbrush. It was exactly the kind of country where something could remain hidden. On the afternoon of October 20th, they were riding along the sandy bank of Bluff Creek, their horses picking their way through the debris left by seasonal flooding. The day was cool, the sky overcast. They had found some promising tracks earlier, but had seen nothing definitive. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, they rounded a bend in the creek and came upon a massive fallen tree, its root system torn from the bank and now jutting into the sky. Beyond the roots, on the far side of the creek, something was moving. The horses reacted before the men did. Patterson's horse reared violently, throwing him from the saddle. Gimlin fought to control his own mount as it danced and snorted in fear. Patterson hit the ground hard but scrambled to his feet immediately. He had seen what spooked the horses. On the far bank of the creek, perhaps 100 feet away, a massive figure was walking. Patterson grabbed the 16mm movie camera he had brought specifically for this moment. Running toward the creature, struggling for balance on the loose sand and river stones, he began filming. What he captured in the next 60 seconds has been viewed, analyzed, debated, and scrutinized more than perhaps any piece of film in the history of visual media. The footage is shaky at first. Patterson was running when he started filming, but stabilizes as he drops to one knee. It shows a creature walking along the creek bank from left to right, moving away from the camera. The figure is unmistakably bipedal, walking upright with a fluid rolling gait. It is covered in dark hair, appearing almost black in the overcast light. It is massive, with broad shoulders and long arms that swing naturally as it walks. At one point, the creature turns and looks back at the camera. This moment, frame 352, as researchers would later designate it, captures the face, a flat nose, heavy brow ridges, and an expression that seems almost curious rather than frightened. The creature holds this gaze for barely a second, then turns away and continues walking. Perhaps most significantly, the creature is clearly female. The breasts are visible as she turns, pendulous, covered in the same dark hair as the rest of her body, but unmistakably mammalian. This is not a costume with crude padding. This is apparent anatomy. The figure walks steadily away from the camera, eventually disappearing into the tree line at the edge of the frame. The footage runs for approximately 60 seconds, though only about 20 seconds capture the creature clearly. Patterson and Gimlin did not pursue her. Their horses were still panicking, and both men were frankly terrified by what they had just witnessed. But after calming the animals, they examined the site where the creature had walked. They found footprints, clear, deep impressions in the sand, 14.5 inches long, pressed down by substantial weight. They followed the tracks for some distance before losing them in harder ground. Using plaster they had brought for exactly this purpose, they made casts of the best specimens. The film was developed within days and shown to researchers, scientists, and eventually the general public. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Skeptics declared it an obvious hoax, a man in a costume filmed at distance to obscure the details. They pointed to Patterson's history as a promoter, his need for money, his convenient possession of a camera at the moment of encounter. They searched for the person who had worn the suit, the costume maker who had built it, anyone who could definitively expose the fraud. They found nothing. Believers pointed to details in the footage that seemed to defy explanation. The proportions of the figure, the arm length, the shoulder width, the leg structure, did not match human anatomy. Biomechanical analysis of the creature's gait suggested a locomotion pattern different from human walking, with movement in the leg muscles visible beneath the skin. Special effects experts, asked if they could recreate the footage with the technology of 1967, were divided, with several concluding it would be extremely difficult or impossible. The debate has continued for decades. Each year, it seems, new analysis is conducted. Computer modeling, frame-by-frame enhancement, comparisons with human and primate locomotion. The film has been examined by Hollywood effects artists, physical anthropologists, and forensic experts. No consensus has emerged. Roger Patterson died of cancer in 1972, just 5 years after the filming. On his deathbed, he swore to family members that the footage was genuine, that he had filmed a real creature on the banks of Bluff Creek. Bob Gimlin stopped, speaking publicly about the incident for many years, exhausted by the controversy, the accusations, the endless questioning. He had been promised a share of any profits from the film, but never received significant compensation. The experience left him bitter and withdrawn. But Gimlin never recanted. In later years, as interest in the film revived, he began speaking again, carefully, reluctantly, but consistently. In interviews conducted well into his 80s, Gimlin described what he saw that afternoon in the same terms he had used in 1967. A massive creature, walking upright, covered in dark hair, disappearing into the forest. He does not claim to know what it was, he only claims that it was real. The Patterson-Gimlin film remains the most famous piece of Bigfoot evidence ever captured. You can watch it today. It is freely available, endlessly copied and shared across the internet. You can study the figure's movement, examine the proportions of its body, watch the moment it turns and looks back at the camera. Then you can make your own judgment about what walked along Bluff Creek on the afternoon of October 20th, 1967. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, a family in rural Oklahoma experienced something that would force them from their home. The location was near Honobia, a tiny community in LaFlora County, tucked into the western slopes of the Kiamichi Mountains. This is a region of deep hollers and forested ridgelines where the Uawachita Mountains begin their rise toward the Ozarks. The population is sparse. The forests are vast. It is possible to walk for miles in these hills without encountering another human being. It is also, according to researchers, one of the most active areas for Bigfoot sightings in the entire United States. The family, whose name has been withheld at their request, had lived on their property for several years without incident. Their home was modest but comfortable, situated at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. They kept dogs for companionship and security. They raised chickens and a few goats. They lived the quiet, self-sufficient life common to rural Oklahoma. The trouble began in late summer of 2000. At first it was sounds, whoops and howls from the forest at night, sounds the family initially attributed to coyotes, though they did not quite match any coyote vocalization they had heard before. Coyotes yip and bark in a certain way, a pattern that anyone who has lived in wild country learns to recognize. These sounds were different, deeper, more modulated, almost like syllables. The dogs noticed before the humans did. Animals that had always been calm and well-trained began exhibiting signs of stress. They would bark frantically at the tree line, hackles raised, every muscle tense, then suddenly fall silent, tuck their tails, and refuse to leave the porch. Something was out there, something that frightened them in a way coyotes and black bears never had. Then came the footsteps. The family began hearing heavy, rhythmic impacts on the ground around the house, especially after dark. The footfalls were clearly bipedal, not the 4-beat gait of a deer or the shambling rhythm of a bear, but the deliberate 1-2, 1-2 of something walking on 2 legs. The steps circled the house slowly, as if the walker were examining the structure, testing it. Livestock began disappearing. Chickens first. Not unusual in itself, as predators often took birds left out at night. But there were no feathers, no blood, no signs of struggle. The chickens were simply gone, as if plucked from the ground by something that left no trace. Then a goat went missing. A full-grown goat, capable of making noise, capable of fighting back, gone without a trace. The family found footprints the next morning. Massive, human-like prints, pressed deep into the soil near where the goat had been penned. They began keeping the dogs inside at night. They reinforced the animal enclosures. They watched the tree line more carefully as evening approached. But the activity did not diminish. If anything, it seemed to intensify, as if their attention had encouraged rather than deterred whatever was out there. The first clear sighting came on a night in early autumn. The father of the family was sitting on his porch, rifle across his lap, watching the edge of the property. The moon was up, casting enough light to see shapes and shadows, but not details. He noticed movement near the tree line. At first, he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, perhaps a deer stepping cautiously into the clearing, but as he watched, the shape resolved into something else. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, standing upright, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out the trees behind it. It was watching the house, watching him. For what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds, man and creature stared at each other across the distance. Then, with no apparent urgency, the thing turned and walked into the forest. Its gait was fluid, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. After that night, the sightings multiplied. The creatures, and there were clearly more than one, began approaching closer to the house. Family members would glimpse them at dusk, standing just inside the tree line. They would hear footsteps on the porch in the middle of the night, heavy and deliberate, circling the house. Rocks began striking the walls and roof. This was the development that truly terrified the family. It was one thing to be watched, to sense a presence in the darkness. It was another to be actively assaulted. The rocks came at night, thrown with considerable force, striking the siding and shingles with sounds like gunshots. The family would huddle inside, listening to the impacts, too frightened to investigate. On multiple occasions, family members reported seeing faces at the windows, faces that were clearly not human, too large, too flat, covered in hair, with eyes that caught the light in the darkness. The faces would appear for a moment, then vanish, as if the creatures were checking to see who was home, what defenses were in place. The family contacted local authorities, who were sympathetic but powerless. This was not a situation law enforcement was equipped to handle. What could they do? Arrest a Bigfoot? Researchers from the Bigfoot community learned of the situation and visited the property. They documented the activity. They recorded audio of the vocalizations. They photographed the footprints and the impact marks on the walls. They sat with the family through terrifying nights, watching the tree line, waiting. But nothing seemed to discourage the creatures. If anything, the attention seemed to make them bolder. By early 2001, the family had had enough. They made the wrenching decision to leave their home, a home they had invested years in building, a property they had expected to live on for the rest of their lives. They moved away, leaving behind everything they could not carry. In interviews with researchers, they described feeling genuinely unsafe, not merely frightened, but convinced that the creatures were becoming bolder, that eventual physical confrontation was likely. They did not want to find out what would happen if they stayed. The property has changed hands several times since then. Subsequent owners have reported occasional strange occurrences, sounds in the night, unexplained footprints, but nothing approaching the sustained harassment the original family experienced. Why that family? Why that property? Why that particular time? These questions have no satisfying answers. The siege at Honobia remains one of the most disturbing extended encounters on record. For more than a decade, Paul Freeman walked the forests of southeastern Washington, documenting encounters that would make him one of the most controversial figures in Bigfoot research. Freeman was a watershed technician for the United States Forest Service, responsible for monitoring water quality and wildlife activity in remote sections of the Blue Mountains. His job required solitude, patience, and an eye for detail. He spent weeks at a time in country where most people never ventured, following streams to their sources, checking monitoring stations, cataloging the subtle changes that mark the seasons. In 1982, while working near Mill Creek, Freeman had his first encounter. He came across a set of enormous footprints in the mud and, following them, caught a brief glimpse of a large, dark figure moving through the trees. The sighting lasted only seconds, but it was enough to change the trajectory of his life. Freeman reported what he had seen. The response was mixed. Some colleagues were intrigued. Others were openly dismissive. A Forest Service employee claiming to have seen Bigfoot was, at best, an embarrassment. At worst, it raised questions about his judgment and reliability. But Freeman did not stop looking. Over the following years, he documented dozens of footprints, making careful plaster casts that showed what he believed were individual differences between creatures, as if he were encountering members of a small population rather than a single animal. He recorded vocalizations on audio tape. He spoke with other witnesses in the area, building a picture of sustained activity in a specific region. He also became increasingly controversial. The problem was not just that Freeman claimed multiple sightings, it was that he claimed so many of them. Year after year, he continued to encounter evidence. Footprints appeared where he happened to be working. Creatures crossed his path at convenient moments. For skeptics, this was too much coincidence. Either Freeman was the unluckiest or luckiest man alive, or he was manufacturing evidence. Then, in 1994, Freeman captured video footage. The circumstances were unremarkable. He was driving along a forest road when he spotted something unusual in a clearing ahead. Grabbing the camcorder he now routinely carried, he began filming. The footage shows a large, dark figure walking through tall grass and thin timber, roughly 300 feet from the camera. The creature is moving away from the observer, its back to the camera for most of the sequence. The footage is shaky. Freeman was shooting from a vehicle on an unpaved road, and the distance means fine details are not visible. But the basic proportions are clear. The figure is bipedal, walking upright with long strides. Its shoulders are broad, its arms long. Its gait is fluid and unhurried, consistent with a large primate moving through familiar terrain. Critics immediately claimed the footage was faked, a man in a costume filmed at distance to obscure the details. The fact that Freeman had a history of claims made him an easy target. Why should anyone believe him? But defenders pointed out several factors. Freeman was a trained wildlife observer whose job involved spotting subtle signs in complex terrain. He worked in an area with a long and well-documented history of sightings, stretching back decades before his employment there. And unlike someone seeking publicity, Freeman seemed almost reluctant to publicize his findings, aware of the professional damage they had already caused. More importantly, the footprints Freeman cast during this period have been studied extensively. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University and one of the most credentialed scientists to take Bigfoot research seriously, has analyzed many of them. Meldrum found what he considers evidence of authentic biological variation, differences in toe position, arch structure, and pressure distribution that would be extremely difficult to fake consistently across hundreds of specimens. Paul Freeman died in 2003. He never profited significantly from his experiences and never achieved the vindication he sought. In his final years, he expressed frustration with both believers who expected him to prove Bigfoot existed and skeptics who had branded him a liar without examining his evidence fairly. The Freeman footage remains debated. You can find it online, study the figure moving through the trees, and reach your own conclusions. But remember, as you watch, the years that led to that moment, the footprints, the sightings, the professional cost of speaking about what he had seen. Whatever Paul Freeman was, he was not casual about his claims. He gave his career for them. The decade of the 1970s produced numerous notable Bigfoot reports across the United States, but few as strange as the events on a small farm in western Tennessee. The property belonged to a family we will call the Carters, a pseudonym used to protect their privacy. The farm was located in a rural area near the Kentucky border, surrounded by typical West Tennessee landscape, flat fields interspersed with stands of hardwood, creeks cutting through low ground, and patches of swamp where the water table rose close to the surface. The Carters raised cattle and grew tobacco, living much as their ancestors had for generations. They were not newcomers to the land. They understood its rhythms, its sounds, its wildlife. They knew which birds called at dawn, which frogs sang at dusk, which animals moved through the fields at night. In early spring of 1976, something new entered that world. The first signs were subtle. Cattle would be found far from where they had been penned the night before, gates standing open despite having been secured. The family's dogs, calm, working animals that had spent their lives on the farm, became increasingly agitated. They would bark for hours at the darkness beyond the fence line at something the family could not see. Then came the footprints. A heavy spring rain had softened the ground near the creek that ran along the farm's eastern boundary. When a family member went to check on the cattle one morning, he found tracks. Human-like in shape, but impossibly large, 17 inches from heel to toe, pressed deep into the mud. The stride between prints stretched nearly 5 feet. He followed the tracks for some distance. They led from the creek, where whatever made them had apparently crossed the water, through an open field, and to within 50 yards of the farmhouse before turning back toward the woods. Whatever had made them had walked straight toward the house in the night, then departed before dawn. The family began keeping watch after dark. They reinforced the dog pens and the cattle enclosures. They started carrying firearms when they walked the property. They were not looking for trouble. They simply wanted to understand what was happening on land. Their family had worked for generations. Over the following weeks, the activity intensified. They began hearing sounds at night, heavy footsteps in the yard, strange vocalizations from the woods that sounded almost like language, and on several occasions, what seemed to be something large moving on the roof of an outbuilding. Objects left outside were disturbed or moved. A salt lick set out for the cattle was torn from its mount and carried away. The stake that had anchored it snapped like a twig. Feed bins were knocked over. Gates were unlatched in ways that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than accident. The encounters peaked in late April. The father of the family was awakened around 2 in the morning by the dogs going frantic. Every animal on the property was making noise, dogs barking, cattle lowing, chickens squawking in their coop. Something had set them all off simultaneously. Grabbing a flashlight and a rifle, he stepped onto the back porch. The night was dark but clear, the stars bright overhead. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the yard, toward the barn, along the fence line, and found himself face to face with something that should not exist. The creature stood perhaps 30 feet away, clearly visible in the beam of his flashlight. It was massive, well over 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8. Its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, thick and matted, like the coat of an animal that had never been groomed. Its shoulders were enormously broad. Its arms hung nearly to its knees. Most disturbing were the eyes. In the flashlight's beam, they reflected back with a reddish glow, not the green or yellow eyeshine he had seen in raccoons and opossums, but something darker, something that seemed to hold both intelligence and menace. For what felt like an eternity, man and creature stared at each other. The farmer had his rifle. He could have fired, he should have fired perhaps, if only in self-defense. But he did not. Afterward, he struggled to explain why. The creature had not threatened him. It had simply looked at him as if evaluating him, as if deciding whether he was a threat. And something in that gaze, some quality he could not articulate, had stayed his hand. The creature turned and walked away, not running, not hurrying, simply walking with that long, unhurried stride back toward the tree line and the darkness beyond. The family reported the incident to local authorities, who took the complaint seriously but had no explanation to offer. A deputy visited the farm the next morning, examined the footprints that remained, and shook his head in bewilderment. He had never seen anything like them. Over the following months, the activity gradually diminished and eventually ceased entirely. The creatures, for the family came to believe there had been more than one, apparently moved on as mysteriously as they had arrived. The Carters continued to live on the property for another 2 decades. Occasionally they heard sounds in the night or found signs of something large passing through, but they never had another direct encounter. Whatever had visited them in the spring of 1976 did not return. Or perhaps it did return from time to time, but was simply more careful about being seen. The boreal forests of Ontario stretch for hundreds of thousands of square miles, a vast expanse of lakes and spruce and silence. For the indigenous Ojibwe people, these forests have always held secrets, including creatures they call the Wendigo, beings of great size and power that wander the wilderness. When 5 friends from southern Ontario planned a canoe trip into this wilderness in the summer of 1988, they were not thinking about legends. They were thinking about fishing, about solitude, about escaping the noise of the city for a week of clean air and quiet water. They were experienced outdoorsmen, all of them. They had taken similar trips before and knew how to handle themselves in remote country. The route they chose would take them through a chain of lakes in Crown Land north of Lake Superior, territory seldom visited by other humans. For 3 days, everything went exactly as planned. They paddled through crystalline waters, portaged between lakes, made camp on rocky points with views that stretched to the horizon. They caught walleye and pike. They saw moose and beaver. They sat around campfires at night, watching the northern lights flicker above the tree line. On the 4th night, their trip took a different turn. They had made camp on a small island in Snell Grove Lake, a cautious choice, as islands offered natural protection from curious wildlife. The island was perhaps an acre in size, heavily forested on one end, rocky and open on the other. They set up their tents on the rocky side with a clear view of the water and the far shore. Around midnight, they were awakened by sounds, heavy splashing, as if something large was moving through the water. The lake was calm, There was no wind to create waves, and the sound was clearly coming from something alive. Not a fish breaking the surface, something bigger, something waiting. They lay in their tents listening as the splashing continued. It seemed to be moving around the island, circling their position. Then came vocalizations, deep guttural sounds unlike anything any of them had ever heard. Not wolves, not owls, not any animal they could name. The splashing stopped. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The night was silent except for the hammering of their own hearts. Then they heard footsteps on the island. Moving through the brush at the far end, coming closer. One of the men grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the sound. In the beam, perhaps 50 feet away, he caught a glimpse of something large and dark standing among the trees. He could not make out details, just the shape, upright, massive, far too big to be a kikoro man. Then it was gone. Moving away through the forest with surprising speed, crashing through underbrush that should have impeded anything that large. The men did not sleep. They huddled by their fire, which they rebuilt to blazing, watching every direction at once, listening to sounds that continued sporadically throughout the night. Footsteps in the brush, splashing in the water as if something was circling the island again. Once, what sounded like something testing the canoes they had pulled up onto the rocks. At first light, they broke camp with frantic haste. They examined the shore before departing and found what they feared: large footprints in the soft ground near the water's edge. The prints were human-like in shape, but far larger than any human foot, and the stride between them was enormous. They paddled south without stopping, abandoning the remainder of their planned route until they reached a larger lake where they encountered other paddlers. The relief at seeing fellow humans was overwhelming. The 5 men have remained friends in the decades since. They rarely speak of what happened on Snell Grove Lake, even among themselves. Some have shared the story with researchers, always requesting anonymity, always emphasizing the same details: the splashing, the footsteps, the glimpse of something in the flashlight beam. None of them have ever returned to that lake. None of them ever want to. Not all encounters occur in remote wilderness. Sometimes Bigfoot crosses paths with humans in the most mundane of circumstances, on a lonely highway in the middle of an ordinary night. Jay Barker was a truck driver, long haul, spending most of his life behind the wheel on the highways of the American West. He had driven through every kind of terrain, in every kind of weather, at every hour of the day and night. He was not prone to flights of fancy. He was a practical man who believed in what he could see and verify. On a night in the summer of 1977, he saw something he could not explain. Barker was making a late-night delivery run, hauling cargo through the mountains of Utah. His route took him through Provo Canyon, a winding highway surrounded by steep slopes and dense forest, the kind of road that demanded attention even in daylight. At 3 in the morning, with no other traffic in sight, he was alert but relaxed, his radio playing softly as he navigated the familiar curves. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated something in the road ahead. His first thought was bear. Black bears were common in the canyon, and occasionally one would wander onto the highway, attracted by roadkill or simply confused by the pavement. Barker began to slow, giving the animal time to move. But as he got closer, he realized this was no bear. The creature was standing fully upright in the center of his lane, facing his approaching truck. It was enormous. Barker would later estimate 8 feet tall or more, covered entirely in dark hair. Its arms hung nearly to its knees. Its shoulders were impossibly broad. In the glare of his headlights, Barker could see its eyes. They caught the light with a yellowish shine, fixed directly on him, watching as his truck approached. He brought the vehicle to a stop about 40 feet from the creature. For several seconds, nothing happened. Man and thing stared at each other through the windshield, the truck's engine rumbling in the silence. Then, the creature moved. Not quickly, not urgently, almost leisurely. It turned its body, stepped to the side, and walked across the remaining lane toward the guardrail. With apparent ease, it stepped over the rail and disappeared down the slope into the darkness below. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Barker sat in his truck for several minutes, heart pounding, trying to process what he had just seen. Then, because he had a delivery to make and a schedule to keep, he drove on. But he could not shake the image from his mind. He did not report the sighting immediately. Truck drivers depend on their reputations for reliability, and he was not eager to be labeled crazy. A man who sees monsters on the highway does not inspire confidence in dispatchers and clients. But he eventually told the story to a few trusted colleagues. To his surprise, he learned that others had reported similar experiences on that same stretch of highway. Provo Canyon had a long history of Bigfoot sightings, a history Barker had known nothing about before his encounter. What struck Barker most in the years that followed was the creature's apparent lack of concern. It had shown no fear of his truck. It had watched him approach with what seemed like curiosity rather than alarm. And when it was ready to leave, it left, not fleeing, not hurrying, but simply walking away into the night. Whatever these creatures are, Barker concluded, they are not afraid of us. They simply prefer to avoid us most of the time. And on a dark highway at 3 in the morning, when no one else was around to see, one of them had allowed itself to be observed. Some of the most compelling evidence for Bigfoot's existence is not visual, but auditory. For those who have studied the phenomenon, there is perhaps no audio evidence more significant than the recordings captured in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California during the early 1970s. Ron Moorhead was a hunter. He had been accessing a remote deer camp in the Stanislaus National Forest for years, hiking several hours through rugged terrain to reach a spot where few other humans ever ventured. The camp was primitive, no structures, no amenities. Just a clearing where he and his companions would set up tents during hunting season. In the fall of 1971, Moorhead and his fellow hunter, Alan Berry, began noticing unusual activity around the camp. Food left outside was disturbed in ways that did not match the behavior of known animals. They heard sounds at night, sounds that raised the hair on the backs of their necks. These were not the ordinary sounds of the forest. Not owls, not coyotes, not any of the creatures they had learned to recognize over years of hunting. These were something else. Whoops, howls, and chattering that seemed to come from multiple directions, as if the camp were surrounded by unseen watchers. And then there were the footprints. Large, human-like impressions in the soft earth appearing around the camp in the mornings after nights of unusual activity. Rather than abandoning the camp, Moorhead and Berry made a decision that would prove historic. They returned the following year with recording equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines capable of capturing high-quality audio. Over the next 3 years, they documented dozens of hours of vocalizations. The recordings are unlike anything captured before or since. The sounds range from simple calls, whoops and howls that carry through the forest, to complex sequences that resist easy categorization. Some segments seem to involve multiple individuals communicating with each other, calling and responding in patterns too organized to be random. Others contain what can only be described as language, repeated syllables, apparent sentences, exchanges that follow the rhythm of conversation. The tapes have been analyzed by linguists, audio engineers, and voice specialists. One of the most thorough studies was conducted by R. Scott Nelson, a former cryptolinguist for the United States Navy, who spent years analyzing foreign communications for military intelligence. Nelson is no casual enthusiast. He is a trained expert in the structure and patterns of language. Nelson's conclusion was stunning. The Sierra Sounds recordings, he believes, contain actual language. Not random vocalizations, not imitations of human speech, language with phonemes, morphemes, and apparent grammatical structure. He identified what he believed were individual speakers with distinct vocal characteristics, engaging in what sounded like genuine communication. Whether Nelson's analysis is correct remains debated. Skeptics argue that the sounds could be faked, or that pattern-seeking minds are finding meaning where none exists. But even skeptics have struggled to explain how the sounds could have been manufactured. The recordings were made in a remote location, at night, with equipment that would have been extremely difficult to manipulate. Some vocalizations include sounds at frequencies outside normal human range. And the sheer duration and variety of the material, hours of recordings captured over multiple years, makes deliberate hoaxing implausibly complex. Ron Moorhead has continued to visit the Sierra camp periodically in the decades since, sometimes capturing additional recordings, sometimes experiencing activity that defies explanation. He does not claim to fully understand what lives in those mountains. He only claims that it is real, that it has been there as long as he has been visiting, and that it communicates in ways that suggest intelligence. The Sierra sounds are available for anyone to hear. You can find them online. Listen to the chattering, the calls, the exchanges between unseen speakers. Decide for yourself whether you are hearing the communication of an unknown species or an elaborate hoax sustained over half a century by men with nothing to gain from the deception. Either conclusion is extraordinary. Our 10th encounter brings us to the dawn of the 21st century and to a piece of footage captured by perhaps the most unlikely witnesses imaginable, a group of teenagers at a Christian summer camp. The Marble Mountain Wilderness lies in Northern California near the Oregon border. It is one of the most remote and rugged areas in the lower 48 states, a landscape of granite peaks, alpine lakes, and old-growth forest that has changed little since the last ice age. The nearest paved road is hours away. The nearest town of any size is even farther. A Christian youth organization had been running wilderness trips into this area for years, taking groups of teenagers on multi-day backpacking expeditions. The trips were designed to build character and faith through physical challenge and exposure to nature. The counselors were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the trails and the terrain. In July of 2001, a group of roughly a dozen campers and counselors set out on one of these expeditions. The weather was good, the group was in high spirits, and nothing unusual occurred for the first several days. They hiked through forests, made camp by mountain streams, and discussed scripture under the stars. On the afternoon of the third day, the group stopped to rest on a ridge with a commanding view of a distant hillside. One of the teenagers had brought a video camera to document the trip for his church youth group back home. He was casually filming the landscape when someone noticed movement on the slope across the canyon. Through binoculars, they could see a dark figure moving along the hillside. It was walking upright, covering ground with long strides through terrain that would have been difficult for any human to traverse at that speed. The videographer zoomed in and began recording. The footage, shot on a consumer-grade camcorder of that era, shows a bipedal figure approximately a mile distant. The extreme range means fine details are not visible, but certain characteristics can be discerned. The proportions appear non-human. The arms seem too long, the shoulders too broad. The gait is fluid and unhurried, consistent with a large primate moving through familiar territory. Most strikingly, the figure appears to be unaware of the observers. It continues its traverse without pause, without looking in their direction, as if simply going about its business on a mountainside it considers its own. The figure disappears into a stand of trees at the edge of the frame. The footage runs for several minutes, including the audible reactions of the witnesses, teenagers expressing confusion, excitement, and in some cases, genuine fear. Their commentary is unscripted and authentic, exactly what you would expect from young people confronted with something inexplicable. After the sighting, the adult counselors debated what to do. They were responsible for the safety of their young charges and were uncertain whether the creature posed a threat. They ultimately decided to continue their planned route, which led away from the area of the sighting. no further incidents occurred. The footage was analyzed by researchers after the trip concluded. Several factors argue against a hoax. The group had no prior interest in Bigfoot. The teenagers were focused on their faith journey, not monster hunting. The timing was spontaneous. They happened to stop at a viewpoint where the creature was visible, and the distance would make faking the sighting extraordinarily difficult. The Marble Mountain footage represents a category of evidence that has become increasingly common in the age of portable cameras. Unexpected captures by witnesses who were not looking for Bigfoot and had no reason to fabricate an encounter. The story of our 11th encounter begins with a simple hike. 3 young men exploring a canyon they had visited many times before. The location was Provo Canyon, the same stretch of Utah wilderness where Jay Barker had seen a creature crossing the highway decades earlier. The canyon remains popular with hikers and campers, offering easy access to scenic terrain just minutes from the city. On an afternoon in late September of 2012, 3 friends set out to explore a side drainage they had heard about but never visited. The day was sunny, the weather warm, and they expected nothing more than an interesting hike. As they made their way up the drainage, walking along a faint trail through scrub oak and pine, one of them noticed something unusual ahead. On the hillside above them, partially obscured by vegetation, was a dark shape. At first, they assumed it was a bear. Black bears are common in the area, and sighting one would not be unusual. But as they watched, trying to get a better view, the shape moved, and moved in a way no bear moves. It stood up. One of the hikers had a cell phone with video capability. He began recording as the group tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The footage shows a large, dark figure rising from a crouched or sitting position among the oak brush. The movement is fluid and powerful, suggesting considerable strength. The figure appears to look in the direction of the hikers, then turns and begins moving up the hillside. This is when the video becomes chaotic. The hikers panicked. You can hear their voices on the recording. Confusion turning to fear, then to something approaching terror. They began running back down the trail, the camera swinging wildly, capturing fragments of forest and sky. In the final seconds of the footage, just before it ends, the figure is briefly visible again, moving through the trees with speed that seems impossible for something so large. The video was posted online shortly after the incident. It quickly went viral, accumulating millions of views within days. The reaction was the typical mix of belief and skepticism. Some viewers saw clear evidence of an unknown creature. Others declared it an obvious hoax, a man in a costume filmed as part of an elaborate internet prank. The 3 hikers maintained that their experience was genuine. They described being terrified, fleeing the canyon as fast as they could run, not stopping until they reached the parking area. One of them reported nightmares for weeks afterward. True encounter or staged hoax? The video alone cannot answer that question, but it captures something that resonates with other accounts. The moment when ordinary people going about ordinary activities suddenly find themselves confronted with something that should not exist. Their reaction, the raw fear audible in their voices, is difficult to fake. Our final encounter takes us to the Cascade Range of Oregon and an experience that a trained scientist is still trying to understand. The witness has requested anonymity. We will call him Dr. M. He is a wildlife biologist with advanced degrees and years of fieldwork experience. His career has taken him into some of the most remote terrain in the Pacific Northwest, studying animal populations and habitat conditions in places where few humans ever venture. In the summer of 2010, Dr. M was conducting a solo survey of a remote drainage in the southern Cascades. The work was routine, documenting wildlife populations, checking water quality, cataloging the plant communities that define the ecosystem. He was well accustomed to spending extended periods alone in the field, and solitude did not trouble him. The area he was studying included a network of small caves, nothing spectacular, just narrow openings in the volcanic rock that had never been formally mapped or explored. He documented them as part of his broader survey, photographing entrances and noting locations for future reference. On his third day in the area, he approached one of these caves and noticed something unusual. A smell, strong and distinctive. A musky animal odor unlike anything he had encountered in years of working with wildlife. He had worked with bears, with elk, with various predators, and knew their scents well. This was different. It was powerful and somehow wrong, as if it came from something his brain could not quite categorize. He photographed the cave entrance and moved on, making notes about the smell, but not thinking much more of it. That night, camping approximately a mile away, he heard sounds in the darkness, low vocalizations, almost like speech coming from somewhere upslope. The following morning, he returned to the cave complex to complete his documentation. As he approached the entrance where he had noticed the smell the day before, he saw movement in the darkness beyond the opening. Something was in there, something large. Dr. M froze. For several seconds, he could see only shadow and suggestion, the hint of mass, the impression of watching eyes. Then the thing moved, shifting deeper into the cave, and he caught a clearer glimpse. It was covered in dark hair. It was far too large to be a bear, and it was watching him. Dr. M is a scientist. His training told him to observe, to document, to gather data. But in that moment, a more primal instinct took over. He backed away slowly, carefully, without sudden movements that might provoke a reaction. He did not try to photograph what he was seeing. He did not call out or approach. He simply retreated. He returned to his camp, gathered his equipment, and hiked out that afternoon, cutting his survey short by 2 days. Dr. M has never officially reported his encounter. To do so would be professional suicide. A wildlife biologist who claims to have seen Bigfoot would struggle to be taken seriously ever again. But he has shared the story with a small number of colleagues and researchers, always on condition of anonymity. He does not know what he saw in that cave, but he knows it was real. And he knows it was watching him with an awareness, an intelligence that he had never seen in any animal before. 12 encounters, 12 moments when ordinary people came face to face with something extraordinary. A century of testimony from the slopes of Mount St. Helens to the caves of Oregon, from the mountains of Utah to the forests of Ontario. What are we to make of these accounts? The skeptical position is straightforward. These witnesses were mistaken, deceived by shadows, by fleeting glimpses, by the tricks that fear plays on the mind. They saw bears misidentified in poor light. They heard sounds distorted by distance and terrain. Their memories were altered by expectation and the passage of time. This explanation requires us to believe that thousands of people across multiple generations have independently made the same mistake. It requires us to dismiss physical evidence, the footprints, the audio recordings, the footage that has resisted explanation for decades. It asks us to assume that every witness was either lying or deceived, without exception, in every case. The alternative asks something different of us. It asks us to believe that somewhere in the vast forests of North America, a species of large primate has survived undetected by science. A creature intelligent enough to avoid capture, cautious enough to leave minimal evidence, but present enough to be encountered by those who venture into its territory. Is this possible? Consider the terrain. The Pacific Northwest alone contains millions of acres of roadless wilderness. New species are discovered regularly in far smaller and more accessible habitats. The ocean, which we have explored far more thoroughly than our forests, continues to yield creatures science has never documented. Perhaps these creatures are rare. a small, scattered population surviving in the most inaccessible places. Perhaps they are intelligent enough to recognize humans as dangerous and skilled enough to avoid us when they choose. Perhaps they have always been there, watching from the shadows, as we built our cities and cut our roads and convinced ourselves that we had mapped everything worth mapping. I do not know what lives in the forests. I only know what these witnesses reported, and I know that they had nothing to gain and much to lose by sharing their stories. They were not seeking fame or fortune. Most wanted only to be believed, to have someone acknowledge that what they experienced was real. The night is deep now. The fire has burned to embers. Outside the circle of light, the forest waits, vast and dark, and full of sounds we cannot explain. Sleep well. And if you hear something moving in the darkness, something that does not match any animal you know, remember the stories you have heard tonight. Remember that the witnesses were people just like you, ordinary people who encountered something extraordinary, and try not to wonder what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Good night.